Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today, revisiting the Tanker Thesis. When I started this YouTube channel, I talked quite a bit about oil tankers regularly. I still talk about them quite a bit, I admit. They remain the largest position in my portfolio. And what I noticed lately, at least with myself and some of the people that I talk to, since we've entered a bull market for tankers, it gets really easy to focus on the here and now and kind of these events that we think are driving the overall oil tanker market. And so I wanted to take a step back today and talk about the original investment case, something that I think that while we were in a bear market was a lot easier to focus on. So, okay, here we go. Now, to be clear, before I get into a lot of those tanker fundamentals, what I think is the main driver of the tanker rates today is definitely the Ukraine-Russian war. More specifically, it's the tensions between the Europeans and the Russians and those altered trade flows coming from Russian oil. Instead of that going to Europe, a lot of that's going on water, on tankers, and into faraway places like India. And that's putting a lot of strain on the tanker market. At the same time, we also have things like the SPR release in the United States. Recently, we've seen VLCC rates have ticked up quite dramatically. A lot of that is also because of these oil releases in the United States and that oil going to places like Europe. So this discombobulation in the overall tanker market because of these conflicts are what is the primary driver at present for the tanker market. Now, I would say that this isn't the reason or the main reason for investing in tankers for me. I did do a trade when the war started. I'll probably explain that at the end of the video if you're interested in that. But the underlying reason for investing in tankers had quite nothing to do with this, okay? And if the war were to end tomorrow and the rhetoric between the Europeans and the Russians were to normalize and trade flows went back to normal, I would expect that the tanker rates would also come back to the pre-invasion levels for tankers. All right, so in tankers, the only thing, or in shipping in general, the only thing that is predictable is that things are unpredictable. This is a chart of oil tanker cycles for a very long time. This is a historical account of oil tanker shipping cycles. And what you'll see on this chart is that there's all these reasons attributed to both of these boom cycles and these bust cycles. You know, in 1970s, there was the Suez Canal closure, the Iranian Revolution, and those both caused big spikes in tanker rates. There was the China boom in the 2000s. I would also attribute this to the Iraq war that was taking place during that, putting more pressure on the supply chain at the time. There's always a reason for these cycles to happen. And if you're in that or you're before that cycle happening, you would probably never be able to predict that one of these things were going to happen. But what this chart does not show you, it does not show you what the fleets look like during or before or after each of these cycles. Even though there's a reason for us to be able to say, okay, well, this is happening now, it doesn't actually take into account how tight the shipping market is, the tanker market in this case, underneath, or how oversaturated it is in some other cases also. Even though we think that there are these short-term events underneath or above, there is something underneath that can also help describe these in addition to these geopolitical contexts. Okay, take a look under the hood now, talk about the oil tanker thesis. First of all, first point I need to make, which to me is really obvious, but most people I think out there don't really believe or understand. And that this is a chart of global direct primary energy consumption. This is basically a chart of all of our energy sources and the demand for those over time. And what you can see from this is that all of the energy sources that we've discovered and used, they are, for the most part, increasing dramatically. Even biomass, things like animal dung and wood, it's barely gone down from where we were maybe 50, 100 years ago. You know, our coal use this year has reached all-time highs. Admittedly, that's probably because of this conflict with Russia and some of that gas getting to Europe. But over time, you can see all of the demand for all of these energy sources increases. This is because of two reasons. First of all, human population over time has been increasing, and it is expected to increase for, I don't know, the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years until it reaches a limit. And then also because as these populations grow, there's also, we tend to have increasing standards of living and thus increasing energy demand. Places that are maybe on a bicycle for transportation today, maybe 10 years down the road, they may have upgraded that bicycle into a scooter, and thus you increase the demand for oil. And these places tend to have very high populations. And you can also imagine in another place where a lot of people are driving scooters, they may upgrade that scooter into a car, and then, or that has an ICE engine, and then you'll see increasing oil demand from there as well. The main place that you will, in my opinion, see oil demand growth is not from these OECD countries. That has largely been actually flatlining for the last decade or so, and that's partly because I think a lot of the population in a lot of OECD countries has been flatlining for a decade or so. But again, it's going to come from these non-OECD and poorer places. Now, the additional point I would like to make is that these places that are going to have increasing oil demand, they also tend to not have the best developed infrastructure. And so places where we might see a lot of that oil go through pipelines, in these places that have increasing demand, a lot of that will not go through pipelines. It will instead go through things like our tankers. So point I wanted to make here, demand for oil, despite a lot of the popular narratives out there, is increasing and will increase over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And the way that that is transported is going to largely be in those marginal increases in demand. A lot of that will be on water. Okay. To me, this is the crux of the investment case for oil tankers. Even if I am wrong, and let's say that there are some, there's some people out there that think that oil demand is going to decline or flatline in the near future. Even if I'm wrong and the oil demand does go down, to me, it still does not solve this looming problem that I've identified with the tanker fleet. Okay. Now, first of all, this is tanker fleet age, and yes, this chart is about a year and a half old, but it breaks down the vessel sizes very well, and I wanted to share this chart to explain my thoughts here. Okay, first of all, when a vessel reaches, especially a large vessel, reaches about 20 years of age, the efficiency of that vessel declines rapidly. And a lot of that has to do with environmental regulations. As that vessel gets 20 years old, the ship has to go through surveys to make sure that it is still able to be safely transporting oil on sea. After a certain period of time, the tanker, it loses the ability to safely transport oil, especially as the steel on these ships bends back and forth for really long periods of time. Now, there's kind of this idea that says, okay, when that vessel hits 20 years old, they'll go out and they'll scrap the ship immediately. That's kind of not how it works. I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But what I do want to show you guys is that when a vessel gets to 21, 22, 23, every year after 20 years old, the probability that that ship gets scrapped is higher and higher and higher relative to a 20-year-old, right? By the time you get to 23, 24, the amount of VLCCs and Suezmaxes you can see here are almost nil. Now, I'm making a point of these VLCCs and Suezmaxes because those are the largest vessels. And if we're thinking about overall tightness in the market, I think about the entire market in terms of its overall tonnage carrying capabilities, right? If the market for VLCCs is extremely tight, for example, that is the most likely scenario where you will see a tremendous tightness in the overall tanker market, because these are the biggest vessels. They carry the most amount of oil. There are scenarios where different vessels can carry oil to the places where a VLCC, you can take two Suezmaxes, for example. in many places to take a VLCC's cargo to one place or another, right? So if you have really tight capacity in these larger vessels, the probability that you're going to go into an overall strong market for all vessels thus becomes very high, right? Okay, now what you can see on this chart, and keep in mind this is a year and a half old, the amount of 18-year-old vessels, especially those bigger ones like I mentioned, they're going to be 20 in 6 months. And the year after that, you have an increasing amount of vessels. They're going to be 20 the year after that. And in the 16-year-olds, they're going to be 20 the year after that. And then every year, so you'll see more and more scrapping, especially if you are in a bear market. Now, I mentioned before that I think in the beginning that I thought that if the Russian situation were to resolve, that the tanker rates would go back down. And I think that is true because I think that based on some other evidence that I've seen in the past, I think that the market is oversupplied based on 2019 levels of demand by about 50 to 100 of these large vessels, right? But what you can see is it only takes a year or two in the coming time frame where you're going to have a lot of these very large vessels becoming increasingly efficient, and the probability of those vessels again being scrapped very high. Now, again, what you need to keep in mind, though, is that every year for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so years is going to have a tremendously large amount of very, very old, inefficient, and high probability of scrapping candidates, right? This problem, there's only one way that this can be solved. And there aren't banks out there to give a person a loan. You know, there's that ESG concept out there. They'll say, oh, okay, well, you know, again, like that concept I mentioned, oil demand's going down. Even the oil tanker owners, a lot of them themselves, I think a lot of them believe this zeitgeist too, where they think that oil demand's going to go down. There's so many vessels that need to get built, and there's no speculation on these vessels happening. I've also mentioned in some of my videos before that the markets, what do you call them? The shipyards are filled with all of these container ship vessels, and it exacerbates this coming problem even further because in the next year, 2 or 3 years, we're not going to see almost any tankers being built. And at the same time, you know, these vessels don't stop aging, right? So this inevitably causes a squeeze, right? The only way that these vessels are going to be replaced is through a very strong bull market. Eventually, these will reach a point when there's an inflection point. It could be now. It might be this conflict that we're at now. It might be next year. It could be the year after that. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's only one way to solve this problem. It's through very high rates for an extended period of time until these companies are capitalized enough and the shipyards have expanded enough as it is today in order to build and replace all of these vessels. And again, none of this takes into account the possibility that we see increasing oil demand on water for especially those non-OECD countries where there might be the probability that there is an increasing demand for oil on water to these places. Okay, what we're looking at here is tanker demo and scrapping. Again, what I wanted to make a bigger point of is this orange line. This is the total deadweight tonnage of vessels being destroyed. This is the more important. The blue line is total vessels. Now, what you'll notice is that these scrapping rates go through cycles, much like you might observe with the tanker rates. Recently, I saw a video from Trader Ferg. Basically, he did a deep dive in tankers, and he changed his mind on tankers. I believe that was in 2021. And his idea is that they were not scrapping at the rates that they were replacing vessels at that time. But I don't really think that he was looking at the bigger picture. And what I don't think he was thinking about is that these scrapping cycles, they also depend on the kind of a market you're in, right? when you're in 2020 and the tanker market started going off a cliff, uh, the tanker owners didn't suddenly start scrapping ships. What you'll notice is if you observe these ship owners and their behaviors when they start scrapping vessels, on average, when you really start to see those big spikes and those tick ups is 18 or so months into a bear market. Now in 2014, 2015, there was a bull market in tankers, and you can see that the scrapping rates rapidly declined. 2017, 2018, they went up dramatically because after a period of a bull market, about 18 months again, that is when they really started scrapping. That is what we began to see in 2021 and towards the beginning of this year. But again, we have recently entered into a bull market, and so that scrapping has declined. I would mention, though, that even though we are in a bull market, the scrapping that we are seeing is still higher than I would have expected. And that might also, again, be to the increasing amount of very old vessels that we have on the water. Okay, so this is my official continued plan for the tankers. This is not advice, it's just what I'm doing. And let me explain this first of all. I kind of have two positions, at least how I see tankers. That doesn't mean I only own one company, I do not, but I have two ways of thinking about the overall amount of positions that I have in tankers. Now, first of all, I had that core position that I started before the Russian invasion that I've been holding for quite some time. And there is also another position that I started when the war started, kind of as a trade idea. And to kind of explain that trade idea, I made a video on this. Maybe I'll put a link to it somewhere below. When the war started, I kind of saw two possible outcomes for the conflict. The first was that, tensions would increase between the Europeans and the Russians, and the other was tensions would not increase. Okay. And so in the first outcome, I saw that, well, tankers, the probability that their earnings would go up dramatically was very high. And in the second scenario, that I thought that these Russian equities that sold off dramatically, they were tremendously undervalued in that scenario because it would be a period of time that those would trade much higher, right? So that trading position, the tankers that I have in that have basically covered the position in the Russian the companies that I own as well. Now, I may not actually own those by the end of this conflict. Who knows? Either my government or the Russian government may say that I am, and they are too unfriendly to do business, and I therefore must be punished by owning these companies, and then I must give my equities back to the Russians for free. I don't know what they'll decide, but what I do know is that if the conflict ends, I'm going to, or the tensions end, excuse me, I will sell that portion of the tanker companies, and then I'll kind of have a lottery ticket on basically those Russian companies that I've purchased. But if the conflict also comes to an end, and I do see that the rates have started to come down, I will not sell my core position because I still want to ride what I think is the larger term cycle, right? But there is a point in which I would sell this core position, and I made a video on this too. Well, three conditions in which I would sell a shipping company, and those are the large supply response. That's not here yet. That'll take a long time, I think, but that will come eventually. High asset prices. Right now, the ships themselves are getting higher on a historical basis. They're not at all-time highs, but they're getting there. But that could also take some time before they kind of reach some kind of a historical peak. And then the third kind of thing that I look for is, a lot of market optimism. When I start to see people measuring the success of these tanker companies instead on things like net asset value and instead on cash flows, that is a red flag for me. When I start to see, a lot of media attention, and when I start to see lots of articles being written on the investment case for tankers, those are the kinds of conditions in which I would identify as market euphoria, and I would exit my full position on those. But I'd be curious to hear all of your guys' thoughts. What do you guys think about this overall idea? What will you guys do with your tanker companies? And I will see you guys soon.